Reichswald Forest, Western Germany, February 8, 1945. Snow lies thin and dirty across the tree line, churned by weeks of shelling into a gray slush that clings to boots and tank tracks alike. In a forward bunker cut into the earth, a handful of Wehrmacht grenadiers crouch behind a machine gun, waiting. They have held this position for 3 days against infantry attacks, against artillery, against the cold. They are not short of ammunition. They are not short of will. And yet, when a strange, squat tank crawls out of the mist, towing what looks like a small armored trailer, something changes in the bunker. Word passes along the trench line faster than any order could travel. Within minutes, without a shot fired from the German side, a white cloth appears on the end of a rifle barrel. This was not cowardice. It was not a collapse of discipline, and it was not, in the main, the result of exhaustion or hunger, though both played their part in the last winter of the war. It was fear of a very specific machine, one whose reputation had traveled through the German ranks long before its flame ever touched their position. That machine was the Churchill Crocodile, and by early 1945 its arrival on a battlefield could empty a defensive line more effectively than a full artillery barrage. To understand why men who had fought through Normandy, through the Ardennes, through years of increasingly desperate defense would surrender to a single tank without exchanging fire, you have to understand what the Crocodile actually did to a fortified position, and just as importantly, what German soldiers believed it did. The two things were not always the same, and that gap between reality and reputation is itself part of the story. Consider what these men had already survived by the winter of 1944 and 1945. Many of the soldiers manning the Reichswald defenses had fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred west, men who had endured Soviet winters, Soviet artillery, and the sort of grinding attrition that hollows out even the most disciplined units. Others were younger conscripts, boys barely out of school folded into understrength divisions scraped together from whatever manpower remained. What united them, whatever their background, was a working knowledge of what modern industrial warfare could do to a human body, and a corresponding calculation, made instinctively in the space of seconds, about which dangers were survivable and which were not. Artillery, however terrifying, offered a kind of arithmetic. A man could estimate his odds, could judge distance and cover and probability. Flame offered no such arithmetic. It did not discriminate between a man crouched low and a man standing tall. It did not spare the corners a shell might miss, and it left nothing resembling a clean death behind it. That distinction, between a danger that could be reasoned with and one that could not, sat at the heart of why the Crocodile's approach produced a different order of response than even heavy bombardment. The tank was, on the surface, an unremarkable modification of an already unglamorous vehicle. The Churchill infantry tank was slow, heavily armored, and never particularly elegant to look at. But bolted onto its front hull was a flame projector capable of throwing a jet of burning fuel more than 120 meters, further than the effective range of most rifles, and towing behind it an armored trailer holding 1,800 liters of fuel, enough for roughly 81-second bursts. The sound alone, described by those who heard it as somewhere between a blowtorch and a jet engine, was enough to unsettle men who had grown almost numb to shell fire. The sight of it, a roaring column of flame rolling across open ground and pouring into bunkers, trenches, and pillboxes, was something else entirely. By the final year of the war in Europe, reports of the Crocodile's approach were enough on their own to persuade German garrisons to abandon positions they might otherwise have defended to the last man. Regimental histories, British after-action reports, and the recollections of the men who crewed these machines all described the same pattern. Resistance that had been fierce against infantry and armor alike would simply evaporate once word spread that crocodiles were moving up. This is a story about why a single weapon, built in modest numbers and misunderstood by almost everyone who has heard of it since, became so feared that its mere presence could end a battle before it began. It is also a story about the machinery of terror itself, about how a piece of engineering translates into something closer to psychology, and about what happens to soldiers, however brave, when the nature of the danger they face changes beyond anything their training prepared them for. By 1944, the Allied armies advancing through Northern Europe faced a problem that tanks, artillery, and infantry alone had never fully solved. Concrete fortifications, the kind the Germans had spent years perfecting along the Atlantic Wall and later across the approaches to the Rhine, were built specifically to withstand exactly the sort of firepower the Allies possessed in abundance. A pillbox with walls a meter thick could absorb direct hits from tank guns and field artillery and remain functional. Machine gun positions dug into reverse slopes were nearly invisible until they opened fire, and by the time an infantry section identified the source, casualties were already mounting. The bocage country of Normandy made matters worse still, with sunken lanes and thick hedgerows turning every field into a potential killing ground, and Germany's western defenses only grew more elaborate as the front moved closer to the homeland itself. Conventional high-explosive shells, however precisely aimed, struggled against a well-built bunker. A tank gun might score a direct hit and still fail to penetrate or to kill the men sheltering inside. Grenades thrown through firing slits demanded that infantry get close enough to throw them, usually under fire, often across open ground with no cover. Casualty rates among assault infantry tasked with clearing fortified positions were brutal, and commanders on all sides understood that taking a heavily defended position by direct infantry assault, however well supported by artillery, could cost a company its fighting strength in a single afternoon. The problem was compounded by the sheer density of German fortification by the middle years of the war. Along stretches of the Atlantic Wall, and later along the approaches to the Siegfried Line itself, pillboxes were sited to provide overlapping fields of fire, so that an attack on one position immediately exposed the attacker to fire from a second, often a third. Minefields extended the killing ground still further, forcing infantry into narrow, predictable lanes where machine gunners could concentrate their fire with brutal efficiency. Engineers on both sides understood the mathematics of this kind of defense in depth perfectly well, and the frustrating truth for Allied planners was that no single weapon in the existing arsenal solved the problem cleanly. Naval gunfire could flatten a stretch of coastline, and often did. Yet concrete emplacements built with walls more than a meter thick frequently survived even direct hits from battleship-caliber guns, their garrisons shaken but very much alive and still capable of manning their weapons once the barrage lifted. Aerial bombing suffered from the same fundamental limitation, since bombs dropped from altitude, however numerous, rarely achieved the pinpoint accuracy needed to eliminate a specific bunker rather than simply cratering the ground around it. The numbers tell their own story. British and Canadian assaults on fortified German positions through 1944 routinely produced casualty rates among leading infantry companies of 30% or more in a single action, and that was against positions that had already been subjected to preparatory bombardment. Some individual assaults on bunker complexes cost entire platoons their fighting strength for the gain of a few hundred meters of ground. This was not a problem that more artillery alone could solve, because the issue was not a lack of destructive power in the abstract, but the difficulty of applying that power precisely enough and close enough to force defenders out of cover that conventional weapons simply could not reach into. Commanders had learned through hard and repeated experience that a bunker did not need to be destroyed to be neutralized. Only its garrison persuaded that remaining inside was more dangerous than coming out. That was, in truth, a different problem from the one conventional weapons were designed to solve, and it called for a rather different kind of answer. What was needed, then, was not a bigger gun. It was a weapon that could reach around corners, so to speak, that could force its way into a firing slit or an open trench without requiring a soldier to stand exposed in front of it, and that could deny an enemy the shelter of a bunker even when that bunker remained structurally intact. Fire achieves something no shell can. It does not merely damage a structure. It consumes the oxygen inside it. It fills every crevice and firing slit that a shell might miss entirely, and it does so in a way that leaves no safe corner to retreat into. Flame weapons had existed since the First World War, largely in the form of man-portable projectors, but these demanded that an operator carry a heavy, flammable tank on his back to within a few dozen meters of the enemy position, an almost suicidal proposition against a defended bunker. Britain needed to put that same capability behind armor, at a range that kept the crew alive, and in a form that could be produced in useful numbers before the war's momentum shifted again. That was the challenge that fell, eventually, to a group of engineers working under conditions of considerable secrecy at a research establishment in Dorset. The organization responsible for solving this problem was the Petroleum Warfare Department, established in 1940 under Sir Donald Banks and based in part around research carried out near Moody Down and at the Fuel Research Station in Greenwich, with trials conducted extensively at Wembley and later at ranges across the south of England. Winston Churchill himself took a close personal interest in flame weapon development, and the department's engineers worked through 1942 and 1943 on a project that would eventually be codenamed Crocodile, adapting existing Churchill tank hulls rather than designing an entirely new vehicle from scratch, a decision that saved considerable time and allowed the weapon to reach frontline units far sooner than a clean-sheet design would have permitted. The department's earlier work had already produced a range of flame-based defensive systems intended to repel a German invasion that, by 1940, seemed a very real prospect, including pipelines designed to spread and ignite fuel across beaches and coastal waters. Some of these earlier schemes acquired their own considerable mythology, with rumors circulating among German intelligence circles about beaches that could supposedly be set ablaze at will, rumors that historians now regard as having outpaced the actual operational reality of the defenses in question. That same institutional culture, one already comfortable working with fire as a weapon of both practical destruction and psychological deterrence, fed naturally into the later work on mobile offensive flame weapons once Britain shifted from defending its own shores to planning the eventual invasion of the continent. The Crocodile, in that sense, was not created from nothing in 1943, but grew out of several years of accumulated expertise in exactly the kind of engineering the project demanded, expertise in handling large volumes of flammable fuel safely, in designing reliable ignition and pumping systems, and in understanding, from the earliest defensive schemes onward, just how powerfully the threat of fire could work on an enemy's morale even before any of it was used. The technical solution centered on two problems that had defeated earlier flame tank designs: how to carry enough fuel to be useful in sustained combat, and how to keep that fuel far enough from the crew and from enemy fire that a single lucky hit would not turn the tank into an inferno from the inside. The engineer's answer was to separate the fuel entirely from the tank itself, housing it instead in an armored trailer towed behind the Churchill, connected by an armored pipe running beneath the hull to the projector mounted where the machine gun would normally sit. This trailer carried around 1,800 liters of thickened fuel, a mixture not unlike napalm in principle, designed to cling to whatever surface it struck rather than simply burning off in a flash. Pressurized by nitrogen or compressed air stored in cylinders within the trailer, the fuel could be projected in controlled bursts lasting around 1 second each, at a rate that gave the crew roughly 80 individual bursts before the trailer ran dry, at which point it could be jettisoned entirely, leaving the Churchill to fight on as a conventional gun tank if needed. The projector itself replaced the hull machine gun on a standard Churchill Mark 7, meaning the tank retained its main gun and could operate as an ordinary infantry tank when the flame equipment was not required, a flexibility that mattered a great deal to commanders planning operations where flame support might only be needed for a single phase of an assault. Range was the Crocodile's genuine innovation. Where earlier flame tanks and infantry-carried projectors were lucky to reach 40 meters, the Crocodile could throw fuel more than 120 meters, comparable to the length of a football pitch, which kept the vehicle outside the effective range of most infantry anti-tank weapons while still close enough for pinpoint accuracy against a firing slit or trench line. Crews described the sound of firing as an enormous roar, likened by more than one veteran to a jet engine or an industrial blowtorch scaled up to grotesque proportions, audible and visible from a considerable distance, which was, in its own way, entirely the point. Production of the crocodile conversion kits took place primarily through Vauxhall Motors, who built the original Churchill hulls, with the flame equipment itself fitted by specialist workshops, and the vehicles were organized into dedicated squadrons rather than distributed piecemeal. Most famously the 141st Regiment, Royal Armoured Corps, which operated as a specialist crocodile unit throughout the campaign in northwest Europe. Exact production figures remain somewhat imprecise in open sources, a legacy of wartime secrecy that was never entirely unpicked afterwards, but estimates generally place total crocodile conversion somewhere in the range of 800 vehicles across the war, a modest number by the standards of Churchill tank production as a whole, reflecting the specialist and closely controlled nature of their deployment. Training crews to operate the crocodile required its own dedicated program, since the vehicle demanded skills that overlapped only partially with conventional tank gunnery. Judging distance accurately mattered enormously, since firing too early wasted fuel harmlessly on open ground, while firing too late risked the vehicle straying within range of enemy anti-tank weapons. Crews also had to learn the particular rhythm of the weapon, understanding how long a burst needed to hold on a target to be effective, how to walk the flame along a trench line rather than simply pointing it at a single spot, and how to manage the ever-present risk that came from towing 1,800 liters of fuel behind an armored vehicle across terrain pitted with shell craters and soft ground. The trailer itself, while armored, remained a vulnerability that crews were acutely conscious of, and standard practice called for it to be jettisoned quickly if the tank came under sustained anti-tank fire, sacrificing the flame capability to preserve the vehicle and its crew. If you're finding this one interesting so far, a quick subscribe genuinely helps more than you might think, it costs nothing, and it lets more of these stories reach people who enjoy this kind of history. Right, back to the Reichswald. And to the rest of the war, the crocodile fought. The crocodile's operational debut came with the Normandy landings in June 1944. Where squadrons of the 141st Regiment supported infantry assaults on fortified positions along the coast and further inland during the grinding battles for towns like Caen. Detailed accounts from these early actions describe German strongpoints that had resisted tank and artillery fire for hours, falling within minutes once a crocodile got within range, the crew walking flame along a trench line or directly into a bunker's firing slit until resistance simply stopped. British reports from this period increasingly noted a pattern that would recur throughout the campaign. Garrisons that saw a crocodile approaching, even before it fired, would frequently choose to surrender rather than wait to discover what came next. The tactics developed for using the crocodile evolved considerably as the campaign progressed, moving from the improvised employment of the earliest Normandy actions towards a much more deliberate doctrine by the time British and Canadian forces were fighting their way into Germany itself. Infantry commanders learned to time their advance carefully around the crocodile's approach, holding their own troops back at a safe distance while the tank closed on a position, then moving forward rapidly once the flame had done its work and resistance had either ceased or surrendered outright. This coordination mattered enormously, since infantry caught too close to a flame burst risked injury from the fire itself, while infantry held back too far gave defenders time to regroup once the tank had passed. Over the course of the campaign, this refined approach became something close to a standard drill within units that had access to crocodile support, with liaison officers from the 141st Regiment attached to supported infantry formations specifically to coordinate the timing of these combined attacks. This pattern intensified through the autumn and winter of 1944 as Allied forces pushed toward the German border itself. During Operation Veritable in the Reichswald in February 1945, crocodiles of the 141st Regiment supported Canadian and British infantry through some of the most heavily fortified ground the Western Allies encountered, a landscape of bunkers, minefields, and flooded ground that German commanders had spent months preparing. Accounts from this operation describe entire company-sized positions surrendering, as soon as crocodiles were identified moving into range, garrison commanders apparently judging, correctly in most cases, that continued resistance against flame simply meant a worse death than capture. Similar reports emerge from fighting around Hertogenbosch in the Netherlands in October 1944, where crocodiles supporting an assault on the town were credited by British commanders with breaking resistance that conventional weapons had failed to shift over several preceding days. Earlier in the campaign, during the fighting to reduce the fortress port of Le Havre in September 1944, crocodiles were used to clear a network of German strongpoints that had resisted repeated bombardment from both air and sea. British reports from the operation describe garrisons emerging to surrender the moment crocodiles began moving into their sector, sometimes before the flame had been used at all against that particular position, the mere confirmed presence of the weapon within the assault force apparently sufficient to change minds that heavy bombing alone had not shifted. A comparable story played out at Calais in the same month, where German defenders holding out in fortified gun positions along the coast surrendered in significant numbers once crocodile units joined the assaulting force, an outcome British commanders noted with some satisfaction in their after-action reporting, since it spared their own infantry the cost of storming positions that had already proven remarkably resilient to more conventional methods. What is genuinely documented, rather than assumed, is that the psychological effect of the crocodile was recognized at the time by British commanders as being at least as significant as its physical destructiveness. Contemporary reports and post-war regimental histories both describe instances where the mere deployment of crocodiles to a sector, sometimes without a shot being fired from them, was enough to prompt local surrenders or a marked collapse in the intensity of German resistance. This should not be overstated into the idea that flame alone won battles single-handedly. German garrisons that lacked good intelligence on crocodile deployment, or that faced them in circumstances offering no realistic option of surrender, continued to fight with the same grim determination seen elsewhere on the Western Front. What can be said with confidence is that where German soldiers had prior knowledge or direct experience of what a crocodile attack meant, that knowledge measurably altered their willingness to hold a position to the last. The word traveled, in effect, faster than the tanks themselves. Prisoners taken in the aftermath of crocodile assaults, when questioned by British and Canadian intelligence officers, frequently mentioned having heard about the weapon from other units before ever encountering it directly, describing garbled accounts passed along supply lines, hospital wards, and rear area briefings that grew more alarming with each retelling. This kind of informal transmission of battlefield reputation was hardly unique to the crocodile, but few weapons of the Second World War seem to have generated quite so consistent or so widely shared a reputation among the men who might have to face it. Some of what circulated was accurate. Some of it was exaggerated well beyond the weapon's genuine capabilities, inflating its range, its fuel capacity, or its resistance to counter-fire in ways the historical record does not support. Both the accurate and the exaggerated versions of the story appear to have produced broadly the same practical effect on morale, which is itself a telling detail about how reputation, once established, becomes almost self-sustaining regardless of its precise accuracy. Not every encounter followed this pattern, and it would be misleading to suggest otherwise. In several documented actions, German positions facing crocodile attack continued to resist with anti-tank guns, Panzerfausts, and small arms fire, in some cases succeeding in damaging or destroying the tanks involved before being overrun by supporting infantry. The 141st Regiment lost vehicles and crews over the course of the campaign, a reminder that the crocodile's reputation, however fearsome, never made it invulnerable, and that German soldiers, when circumstances offered no realistic prospect of surrender being accepted or survived, continued to fight with the same determination seen throughout the war. The picture that emerges from the surviving record, then, is not one of universal, automatic collapse wherever a crocodile appeared, but of a marked and repeatedly observed tendency towards surrender, specifically in situations where surrender remained a live option, a distinction that matters for anyone trying to understand the weapon's true historical effect rather than simply repeating the more dramatic anecdotes uncritically. It's worth being honest here about the limits of the historical record. Detailed German-language accounts specifically addressing the psychological experience of facing crocodiles are relatively scarce compared with British operational reports, partly because the units on the receiving end of these attacks frequently ceased to exist as coherent formations shortly afterwards, their soldiers dead, captured or dispersed before anyone thought to record their impressions in detail. Much of what we know about German reactions comes filtered through British interrogation reports of prisoners, through the observations of British officers watching enemy positions collapse, and through the sparse surviving testimony of German veterans given decades after the event. This is not the same as having a comprehensive German operational history of the weapon's psychological impact, and any account of this subject should hold that caveat clearly in view rather than claiming a certainty the sources do not fully support. Germany fielded its own flame-throwing armored vehicles throughout the war, most notably the Flampanzer II and later conversions based on the Panzer III chassis. And earlier flame tank concepts had in truth been pioneered by French and German engineers in the interwar period before Britain's own program began in earnest. These German vehicles carried considerably less fuel than the Crocodile, typically a few hundred liters carried internally within the tank itself rather than in a separate armored trailer, which meant both a shorter operational endurance and, more dangerously for the crew, fuel stored in close proximity to the fighting compartment, where a penetrating hit risked igniting the vehicle from within. German flame tanks also generally achieved shorter maximum ranges than the Crocodile, typically somewhere in the region of 50 to 70 meters depending on the specific model, which forced them closer to enemy defenses and closer to the effective range of the very anti-tank weapons they were trying to avoid. The American equivalent, developed somewhat later in the war, mounted flame projectors on Sherman tank hulls in vehicles sometimes nicknamed Ronson or Zippo tanks after popular cigarette lighter brands of the period, a nickname whose grim humor reflected exactly the sort of vehicle it was. These, like the German designs, generally carried fuel internally rather than in a towed trailer, sacrificing the Crocodile's range and endurance advantages in exchange for a simpler, more compact vehicle, better suited to the Pacific theater, where they saw extensive use against Japanese bunker networks on islands including Iwo Jima and Okinawa. It is worth noting that the American flame tanks proved enormously effective in that specific theater, arguably even more central to Pacific operations than the Crocodile was to the European campaign, which suggests the underlying concept of armored flame projection was sound wherever fortified positions needed clearing, even as the specific engineering solutions diverged between theaters. What made the Crocodile distinctive, then, was not that Britain invented armored flame warfare outright, since German and later American designs pursued broadly similar goals through different engineering choices, but that the towed trailer arrangement gave British crews a combination of range, endurance, and crew safety that none of the alternative designs quite matched at the same time. 80 seconds of sustained fire potential at a range exceeding 120 meters, with the bulk of the flammable fuel kept safely outside the main armored hull, was a genuinely distinctive combination, and it is this combination that seems to have driven the weapon's particular reputation among the German soldiers who encountered it. There is also the question of what happened to these designs after 1945, which offers its own kind of comparison. The Soviet Union, too, had experimented with flame tanks throughout the war, including flame-throwing variants of the T-34 fitted with equipment broadly comparable in concept to the German designs, again favoring internally stowed fuel over the towed trailer approach Britain had settled on. None of the wartime combatants converged fully on the British solution, which suggests it was not simply an obvious answer waiting to be found, but a genuine product of the specific institutional emphasis the Petroleum Warfare Department placed on range and crew survivability above compactness. Later, Cold War-era flame vehicles, on both sides of the Iron Curtain, would eventually move away from liquid fuel projectors of this kind entirely, favoring other means of clearing fortified positions as attitudes towards flame weapons shifted, and as shaped explosive charges and improved man-portable rockets offered alternative ways of solving the same underlying tactical problem. In that sense, the Crocodile represents something of a high watermark for a particular approach to armored warfare, arriving at exactly the moment fortified positions demanded it and departing from frontline service before changing tactics and changing sensibilities rendered it largely obsolete. Assessing the Crocodile's actual historical impact requires separating two rather different questions, one about material destruction and one about psychology, and the surviving evidence supports the second far more strongly than any simple claim about kill counts or bunkers destroyed. In pure destructive terms, the Crocodile accounted for a meaningful but not enormous share of the fortified positions cleared during the Northwest Europe campaign, operating in relatively small numbers concentrated within a single specialist regiment rather than distributed widely across the whole army. Its true significance lay in how disproportionately its reputation shaped the behavior of German defenders, a reputation that, by the final winter of the war, appears to have preceded the weapon into engagements it had not yet even joined. British commanders who wrote about the Crocodile after the war, along with the surviving members of the 141st Regiment themselves, consistently described a weapon whose presence altered the tempo and outcome of an assault before it fired a shot. Garrisons choosing surrender over confrontation once Crocodiles were spotted moving into position. This is a form of impact that is genuinely difficult to quantify with precision, since it shows up not in casualty figures, but in the absence of casualties that might otherwise have occurred, in positions taken without the bloody infantry assaults that had characterized earlier fighting in the bocage. Historians examining this period have generally treated these accounts as credible, given how consistently they appear across different units, different sectors, and different months of fighting, while also cautioning against treating every individual anecdote as independently verified beyond the specific unit reports in which it appears. The Crocodile's influence on later military thinking was real, if indirect. Post-war armored doctrine in Britain and elsewhere retained an interest in specialist armored engineering vehicles, a lineage that runs through to the wider family of vehicles nicknamed Hobart's Funnies, of which the Crocodile itself formed one part, developed under Major General Percy Hobart's 79th Armored Division, to solve exactly this kind of specialized battlefield problem. Flame weapons more broadly continued to see use in subsequent conflicts through the mid-20th century, though changing attitudes towards their use against fortified positions, along with the development of alternative methods for clearing bunkers, eventually saw armored flame vehicles fall out of frontline service in most Western armies by the later decades of the century. Surviving examples of the Churchill Crocodile can still be seen today, including preserved vehicles at the Tank Museum in Bovington, Dorset, where visitors can examine the hull, the projector mounting, and the general scale of the machine at close quarters, a useful corrective to any account of the weapon that relies purely on written description. Other examples exist in museum collections in the Netherlands and elsewhere in Europe, standing today as static, silent objects in a way that makes it almost difficult to reconstruct the sound and the fear that once accompanied their approach. It is worth pausing, too, on what the Crocodile's story tells us about the nature of military technology more broadly, beyond the specific tactical problem it was built to solve. Weapons are generally judged in retrospect by tallies of destruction, by numbers of positions taken or enemy casualties inflicted, figures that can be totted up in a ledger and compared across different systems. The Crocodile resists that kind of accounting far more than most, because its greatest achievements are visible chiefly in the things that did not happen, the assaults that were not needed, the infantry casualties that were not suffered, the bunkers that emptied themselves rather than being cleared room by room at appalling cost. Military historians studying the psychology of combat have long recognized that the anticipation of a threat can shape behavior just as powerfully as the threat itself, and the crocodile stands as one of the clearer 20th century illustrations of that principle in action, a machine whose reputation, once established, became almost a weapon in its own right, independent of the flame it actually carried. There is also a quieter irony worth noting. The very secrecy that surrounded the Petroleum Warfare Department's work, intended to protect the technical details of the weapon from German intelligence, meant that accurate information about the crocodile's actual capabilities traveled slowly and imperfectly through German ranks. What traveled far more quickly, inevitably, was rumor, exaggeration, and the raw testimony of survivors describing something they had barely had time to comprehend before fleeing or surrendering. In a strange sense, the fog of war that usually obscures a weapon's true nature from its intended targets may have worked in the crocodile's favor, allowing its reputation to grow somewhat beyond even its considerable genuine capabilities, and giving the weapon an psychological reach that stretched well beyond the 120 meters its flame could physically cover. Return, then, to that bunker in the Reichswald, February 1945. Snow turning to slush beneath the boots of men who had fought for years and were not, by any reasonable measure, cowards. They had endured artillery. They had endured cold, hunger, and the slow accumulating exhaustion of a war they increasingly understood they could not win. None of that broke them. What broke them, in that specific moment, was the sight of a machine they had heard about from other units, other sectors, other men who had faced it and did not survive to describe it themselves in anything but the vaguest terms passed hand to hand along a retreating line. That is, in the end, what the crocodile achieved that no amount of conventional firepower quite managed on its own. It did not simply destroy positions. It made positions not worth defending in the minds of the men inside them, before a shot was even fired. 800 vehicles, give or take, built from a tank hull already considered slow and unglamorous by 1944, fitted with a fuel trailer and a length of armored pipe, changed the calculation that thousands of soldiers made in the last desperate months of a losing war. Fear, in this instance, proved every bit as decisive a weapon as fire itself, and perhaps more so because fear traveled ahead of the tank, into bunkers the crocodile had not yet reached, into the minds of men who had not yet seen it and had no need to. The roar of a crocodile in action, described so often by the men who heard it as something closer to industrial machinery than to gunfire, has fallen silent now, preserved only in the quiet, static hulls sitting in museum halls. But for a handful of terrible months across the winter of 1944 into 1945, that sound meant something very specific to the men who heard it approaching through the trees. It meant that the choice in front of them was no longer between victory and defeat. It was between surrender and something considerably worse. Consider, once more, the men in that Reichswald bunker and the thousands like them scattered across the last defensive lines of a collapsing front. They were not unusual. They were not, by any measure history has left us, less courageous than the men who fought and died at Stalingrad, or at Monte Cassino, or in the ruins of Caen. They had proven over years of war a capacity to endure artillery, cold, hunger, and fear in quantities that would break most people within days. And still, faced with the specific and particular danger of the crocodile, something in that calculation shifted. This was not a failure of the German soldier. It was, in its way, a triumph of engineering applied with unusual precision to the deepest and oldest fear a soldier carries into battle. The fear not simply of death, but of a death without any dignity or agency left in it at all. It is tempting, looking back from the comfort of an armchair 80 years later, to reduce a story like this to statistics. 800 vehicles, 1,800 liters of fuel, 120 meters of range, 81-second bursts. Those numbers matter, and they explain the mechanics of what happened. But they do not, on their own, explain why men who had survived the worst the war could throw at them chose, again and again, to lay down their arms rather than face this particular machine. That answer lies somewhere harder to measure, in the gap between what a weapon can physically do and what the human mind, primed by rumor and instinct alike, believes it will do. The Petroleum Warfare Department's engineers in Dorset never set out to build a weapon of pure psychology. They set out to solve an engineering problem, to get flame further, safer, and more reliably onto a battlefield than anyone had previously managed. What they built, almost as a byproduct of getting the mechanics right, was something closer to a rumor with tracks, a machine that did its most important work simply by being seen, or even by being merely expected. Summarize it in the starkest terms available, and the story of the Crocodile becomes this: a slow, unglamorous tank, fitted with a fuel trailer and a length of armored pipe, built in numbers that never exceeded a few hundred at any one time, ended battles that shells could not, cleared bunkers that bombs had failed to crack, and persuaded men who had fought for years without flinching to surrender without firing a shot. It did this not always through the fire itself, but through what that fire had come to represent by the last winter of the war, a certainty, however imperfectly informed, that there was no good way to face it and survive. 800 tanks changed the arithmetic of an entire campaign's final months, not because they were unstoppable in some absolute sense, but because they made continued resistance feel, to the men who had to decide,